Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast,
the Wonderland Trail edition. We're starting with day 1. And Molly and I were also thinking, basically everyone we've ever talked to about how we've spent 4 years trying to get our Wonderland Trail permit, like on the Wonderland Trail, they'll be like, wow, that's so crazy. We got it on our first try. And I feel like I was talking about how it's hard to get this permit as though that's a universal experience, but maybe it's just us.
It's like crazy because I feel like that was our like shtick every time we'd meet someone and be like, yeah, like this is our 4th year of applying and we finally got it. And they'd be like, wow, that's crazy. And so I'm wondering, A, are we the only ones who apply year after year without being able to make an itinerary? Or B, does everyone else just give up and never try again? It's just the people who try their first year. I don't understand, but whatever.
All I know is next year no one will have us as competition because we're not going to apply because we already did it. So the stoke was so high this morning. The one negative for this day was this was looking to be the rainiest day in the forecast for our time on trail. If you're someone who's lived in the Pacific Northwest, then you know what like a summer rain feels like, which is a rare occurrence, I guess there, but versus like the cold winter wet rains. And this was one of those days that just had the feel of that.
Surprisingly, when we woke up at our Airbnb in Packwood, it was actually kind of sunny. Like It looked like the mountain wood probably wasn't out because there were clouds in the general direction of Mount Rainier, but it was a sunny day. And I was like, I know that when I looked at my radar this morning, it showed a literal wall of water coming to inundate us for hours. But right now I feel like I can be in denial.
And it was kind of funny because I feel like the night before it had said it was going to start raining at like 9 a.m. Yeah. And so we kind of talked it through. We only had 10 miles for the first day. A pretty significant portion of it was downhill. And Rachel and Molly and I have hiked together all like so many times. We know how we hike. And we knew that we could do that in like, I don't know, 3.5 hours or so, 4 hours. So we said, you know what? We could start at 9 a.m. and hike in the rain, cold, wet, Pacific Northwest winter vibes type of rain all day, or we could start at like 1 p.m., hike for 4 hours in horrible, miserable rain, and then just not get in our tents and not have to spend hours in our tent that day. So we'd already kind of come to this group decision that we were not in a huge rush to leave the Airbnb. But it was kind of funny because when it was sunny out there, I was like, what if it's sunny all the whole time and then it only rains while we're walking?
And I had done my maths, and I think that we needed to plan for like 3.5 hours of driving total to go from Packwood to get our resupply dropped off at Longmire and then drive all the way to the northwest corner of the mountain to Mowich Lake.
So it was kind of funny in the morning. It was so beautiful out. Rachel was just playing basketball. There was even a basketball hoop at the place that we were staying. But pretty soon we got all of our items put into our cars and we were ready to go. So we drove from there to the ranger station at Longmire, which honestly was such a beautiful morning drive. And it's kind of exciting because you're like, this is kind of the same area that we're going to be in the next few days when we come and pick up this bucket that we're just going to give to the rangers right now. Like I knew I'd see that bucket in 4 days and we'd be in this area in 4 days. So I went in, I gave the bucket to the rangers, and basically all you have to do is, give it to them. You have your name, your permit information, the date you're going to pick it up. All this stuff needs to be like printed out and put onto the side of your bucket.
And you can find the specifics on that once again at Mount Rainier's National Park website.
And I think it also probably would be helpful to write your last name and put it on a piece of tape on top, just because it took them a little while to find it when they had to get it. And I think it was because they had to look at the sides of the buckets. I saw some other people had done that. Don't write it directly on the bucket because they reuse the bucket. So then you'll just have your last name on that forever. So I guess if you're fine with that, that's fine. But that's one tip that I had never heard, but I think that would actually be helpful in speeding up things later on. But so I gave it to the ranger, and while I was giving it to the ranger, Molly and Rachel were checking out this really cool 3D map of the Wonderland Trail and looking at all the places that we were going to go.
And I could at least point out our first 3 campsites, and then after that I was like, it's somewhere in this area. And I knew that the Wonderland Trail would have a lot of elevation gain and loss. I feel like that's what people comment on a lot, is that is pretty intense in that regard. Trying to remember, it was like, it's like 25,000 or so feet that it maybe states that it has. And we ended up closer to 28,000 at the end of it all. And the 3D map could really make it obvious how much up and down we were going to be doing. And when I had sent Rachel kind of the rundown for our daily mileage and elevation gain and loss, when I was putting it out there, I was like, wow, we're going to be just basically doing a lot of the up and down, which Carrie and I have circumnavigated a fair share of volcanoes at this point, and they're all the same. You end up going up and down, but I feel like for Rainier, it's especially pronounced.
I think that one thing that also was funny about this trail was many of the people that we would walk past if we were going uphill would be like, oh, you got to climb. And I think that it kind of shocked us when we did the Timberline Trail the first time, how it was so much you go up and then you go down. But it's like when you really understand, like after that, I feel like I've come to understand more the geography of a mountain and the way that you're walking on these ridges. You go up because you're going to go on this ridge, and then you go down because everything is carved by glacial runoff, or by a literal glacier. So there's these rivers that you have to cross. And I think like for me, I never felt as upset about the elevation gain and descent on this because I just understood like that's the topography of a mountain. That's the geology of it. It's just when you go around a mountain like this, a glaciated big old Pacific Northwest volcano, you're going to go up and then you're going to go down and then you're going to go up and then you're going to go down. And that's just like how it's going to be, except for occasionally you'll get lucky and get to do a little bit of like ridge walking. So we dropped off our buckets though, is what I was.
And there was a 3D map, and now we have gone into a sidebar on volcanoes and elevation profiles.
Yeah. But it was kind of fun because in the parking lot there we saw two girls who had just finished their trip around Mount Rainier, and we kind of got to chatting with them, and they were just so psyched to be done.
But also they did just look like they were pretty tired.
Yeah. And it was fun to talk with them though, because I feel like they were mostly just really positive about the trail, which is nice when people can kind of uplift you before you get started. One thing that was interesting is one of their water filters had fallen out on like their very first day. And I was like, whoa, what did you do? Like, did you just drink unfiltered water, or what was your game plan? And they were like, fortunately, there was another hiker who was just a day hiker. And they said, you can take our filter and just use it because, you guys, I want you to be able to do this trail. And my first thought was like, that is so generous and so kind of that other hiker. And then my second thought was like, oh my gosh, I forgot to bring our backup water purification tablets. And so we only have one water filter between the three of us, which then I was like, well, that's interesting. Normally I do bring two ways to filter our water, but I feel like our stuff was, I don't know, maybe I just didn't put it in the spot where I normally do, and I just did not bring it. So that's another good reminder that you don't necessarily need to have like 2 or 3 water filters, like that just gets excessive at times, but it is good to have a secondary way to treat your water. We just have iodine tablets. So that usually is our backup for if something happened to our water filter. But we did not have it on this trip.
And we've never actually used the iodine tablets, and hopefully we don't have to. And at one point when we were talking about if we wanted to get a water filter or what we wanted to do, Carrie was like, well, I'm never going to use the tablets as my first method because it doesn't get rid of any gross looking bugs.
Yeah, it would make the water good to drink, but I feel like sometimes you'll scoop up water in your bag and you see there's stuff that's made it its home. And so I feel like the steri pen that some people use and all that kind of stuff, I'm just like, I need something with smaller little tiny holes in it so that I just don't have to even think that maybe I'm gonna drink a worm or something. You know what I mean? So yeah, we've never actually used the iodine tablets, and I guess I should read and see if they have an expiration date, because I feel like it's funny, when you first start backpacking, all of your stuff is new. So it's fine, but I guess we've had that for probably 5 or 6 years, and I don't know if there's a limit to how long that works.
So after we had looked at the diorama, dropped off our bucket, and then visited with those 2 girls who had just gotten off the trail, we loaded back up into our vehicles to then make the trek to Mowich Lake. And so at this point, I think we were hoping to get on the trail around 1 or 1:30. And so we love to not eat trail lunch if we don't have to eat trail lunch. And honestly, at this point, if we can avoid eating trail dinner, cool. So
Not because we dislike what we bring for dinner, but have you guys ever experienced the sheer ecstasy of getting to camp and not having to get out your jet boil to boil water? You don't have to wait 20 minutes to eat your food. You just take this smushed up Subway sandwich out of your side pocket and you eat it. And it's like indistinguishable, all the ingredients, because it's so mashed together in your bag. But it's amazing.
Exactly. So we had talked about just getting Subway for lunch and then eating that for supper as well. And fortunately, virtually the only restaurant on our route from the Wilderness Information Center to Mowich Lake was indeed Subway. So we could stop there, get our lunch, and then actually bring that for our first night of supper as well. And so it was like right after we left the Subway, we were maybe an hour and a half from the trailhead where we're going to start our hike. We started to actually get some rain. So that's the crazy thing, is it didn't even start raining until like after 12 p.m. And it started with a little breeze, little clouds, and then the rain. Right when we were like entering the national park, we jumped out of our vehicles to take a picture with the this national park sign, and that was when it was just starting.
So as we drove the road up to Mowich Lake, it was kind of funny because we passed this little fee station. We'd been following this blue pickup truck up there. And when we got to the fee station, we saw a ranger had gotten out, and we're just driving past him. And I didn't even think of stopping at the fee station because we have an America the Beautiful pass, and so does Rachel. So we're just driving by, and it was kind of funny because he like waves at us, and I like wave at him like, "Hello, my good sir." And he like waves at us, and he's like pointing at the fee box. And I was like, "Oh, Molly, you got to stop," and roll down our window, and we're like, "We have an America the Beautiful pass?" And he was like, "Oh, okay, that's fine." But it was kind because really he just did not want to have to write us a ticket in 15 minutes or send us back to get an America the Beautiful pass. Or sorry, to pay the fee, whatever fee, because it is part of the park, so you have to pay. But it's interesting because there's not like a full-time ranger staff there the way that there is at like the Longmire entrance, I believe, and also at like Sunrise or Paradise, because it's kind of the lesser visited corner of the park, is my understanding. I don't know, maybe I'm just making that up, but I'm pretty sure if it doesn't have the ranger fee station with a full-time ranger, it's probably less visited. So when we parked in the parking lot, we were really excited because we could take the first two spots, which I always
it's always ironic because here we're about to walk 95 miles and we're like, yay, we can park the closest to the trailhead. We don't have to walk an extra 100 feet. So we parked there. We were all proud of ourselves, and
we were able to park next to each other, which comes into play far later in the story, but that was actually really important that we were able to do that, by the way. Yeah.
So we parked there, and then like as soon as we pulled up and put the car in park, the rain just started to pour. And we were like, man, we hadn't worn our backpacking clothes because, as you may know, Carrie and I have at this point reduced gear to the point where we wear the same base clothes the entire trip, and we do have sleeping clothes and such, but one pair of shorts, one hiking top. So we weren't wearing those yet because we wanted to not wear them for a couple hours in the day because we were going to wear them for 8 days straight after that. And so they were, of course, in the back, and we were not going to get out and get them in the rain. So Carrie was like crawling to the back of the car to like get her clothes and like change and everything like that. And then we did have to get out like our rain clothes and stuff. So we had to like kind of run through the downpour. And of course, there's like a massive puddle behind the car, and you're like kind of standing underneath the hatchback to just kind of shelter in place. And you're like, okay, I'm gonna be living in this condition for as long as it persists.
Yeah, and I will say I do feel always a little teeny bit smug when I'm sitting in the car when there's a downpour happening, which I guess you can't really feel smug when in about 2 minutes you're gonna have to stand in it, but I'm like, well, I missed 2 minutes of that rain, didn't I? And it is funny, how do we always park in a puddle? Like the puddle's always right where you have to stand. It's like if we would have parked like 6 inches back, we wouldn't have stood in a puddle. But
and it was actually like a river for a while, a river into a puddle, and then so you're like your shoes and your socks are dry, and then you're at the trailhead and they're already getting wet, and you're thinking in the back of your mind and kind of repressing the thought like, how many days are my feet gonna be wet starting now?
And then of course there's like the roll of paper towels that's like repetitively falling out of the back. Just I'm so mad about this. So anyway, once we got all our clothes on, we got our rain gear on. Of course, you're doing the last minute checks of like, did I get my trekking poles? Did I get, did I get like my most important thing, the permit? Like, have I set my America the Beautiful pass on my front windshield? So you kind of do all those last minute things. And then there's kind of this point where you have to say, okay, it's time to go to the bathroom. And so you make your way over to the pit toilet because you're like, this is the last time I'm ever gonna, I guess really this whole trail, the Wonderland Trail has pit toilets the whole way around. So it's not as sad as other trails where you're like, now I gotta dig holes. But I mean, there's a difference, when you're next to your car and you're like, well, then I'm gonna go back and use another hand wipe.
Well, and the toilet paper is provided there, very luxurious. And it was ironic because the ranger, at the Mowich Lake pit toilet. Sorry for talking about toilets so much, everyone. But as we were like approaching it, the ranger had just finished sanitizing it. He's like, I just sanitized these, and it was like, yes, this is great. And then I just couldn't believe how the air was so humid with all of the rain that the toilet paper was just like soaking wet inside of the pit toilet because of the humidity. But whatever. So yes, now that we've actually gone to the bathroom, we can finally embark on our 8 days of hiking. So we were getting ready to hit the trail, and one of the last human interactions we had before that, other than between us and Rachel, was the ranger was like, sorry about all this.
Well, it was kind of funny because our whole interpretation was like it was going to rain today and then it was going to be nice. And we were talking to the ranger and he was like, oh, I'm sorry about all this weather. And we're like, well, that's okay. It's just for today. And he was like, I sure hope so. And I was like, what? Is there a difference? Like, did something else change? He's like, the only thing we can do is hope it gets better. And I was like, what do you mean the only thing we can do is hope it gets better? The weather said it would get better. So then that was kind of funny, but I felt glad because then the ranger left and he was actually very nice to chat with. He was very kind. But after he left, then I was so thankful he wasn't around anymore because we were trying to figure out where the trailhead was. And it's kind of funny because you feel like there would almost be like a large sign that would be like, the Wonderland Trail starts over here. And I saw there was a little sign near the pit toilets that said Eagle's Roost. So I was like, well, we're not going on that because Eagle's Roost is where we're going to be on our last day. So if we go towards Eagle's Roost, we're doing this completely the wrong way, right? We did it counterclockwise, as we like to always do. But the Eagle's Roost would be the first place you go clockwise. So we're not going there. And so then we're like wondering, like, where's the trailhead even? And then I don't know how we came to the decision that it was where it was. I think I looked at the far out maps on my phone and I was like, oh, you actually start out on the same little, connector trail that connects the parking lot to the Wonderland Trail. It doesn't go direct, the trail doesn't go through the parking lot. And so we walked down that trail, just a little ways, and then we got to the spot where it splits off. And
which, sidebar, we've used Far Out for quite a few longer trails like the JMT. When we were in the Wind River Range, we used the Far Out CDT map, and we used it also, I think, for the Timberline Trail. And so the Wonderland Trail is awesome. They have a Far Out map, and it just makes life so easy because it's very easy to see where water sources are, and commenters will mention like how much flow there is, so you don't end up banking on a water source that's on a map but it's actually dry that time of year. So it was pretty handy, and it certainly was handy in that instance because we were able to find where the trail began. So we took a picture with the trailhead sign because with the Wonderland Trail, the actual route, you kind of come up to Mowich Lake. If you're going counterclockwise, you come from the north heading south towards Mowich Lake, and then you could also kind of be more on the eastern side of Mowich Lake doing the Spray Park alternate trail, and we were planning to do the alternate, so that's kind of why it was a little confusing for us. But anyways, we started down on the Wonderland Trail, and we knew that for about 1/10 of a mile we'd actually have to go up that trail at the very end to get back to the parking lot. So we're kind of like, I wonder how we'll feel in a week when we're on this same trail and have to end on an uphill.
In the same way that it's silly to have to park in the parking spots closest to the trailhead, it's also silly, but whenever I start a trail that I'm going to have to come back up, like at the beginning, I'm just always like, I'm going to hate going up this at the end. And it's not that bad.
It's hilarious because it was actually a pretty minor amount of elevation change, but the whole week I was like, well, I'm really going to hate going up at the very end, even though it was not bad. But we started, and it was really ironic because as we started to walk, it actually kind of decreased, like the rain stopped. And so it was still cloudy and super humid, but it wasn't directly downpouring on us. And I felt super smug. I was like, oh my gosh. We timed it perfectly. We were in the car while it was raining, and now it's done raining, and this is amazing. We get to go downhill for 2,500 feet till we get to the Mowich River. Then we'll ascend, but the rain is over.
Yep. We'll see if that's true later. It was 5 miles of descent that we got to start this day with. And I feel like it was just so fun because we hadn't seen Rachel in almost a year. So we were just having good conversations. We're having a good time. We're catching up on all of the weird random things that happen in life. Just, like those little tidbits that come out when you're hiking together for hours and hours all day. And we started seeing people who were hiking the Wonderland Trail, and they all looked pretty dry too, I felt, when they were coming up. So I was like, we're all done with the rain. But it's interesting because you descend those 5 miles. And why do you think we're descending? Did everyone say because there's a creek? Wow, you guys all already learned. So obviously we're descending towards Mowich Creek. And
honestly, I think it's called River.
Well, wait, do you want to hold the microphone where people can hear you?
It's confusing for us because when we did the Timberline Trail, literally every like flow of water we would cross would be called a creek. But I think on the Wonderland Trail, more often than not, it's actually called a river. So we would have to cross, I think it was the Mowich, like the south and north branches of the Mowich River. So it's just confusing because once again, Timberline Trail, it was creek, some rivers. I feel like the majority of streams that we crossed were rivers and they were raging. So yeah, we descended and I feel like we were maybe 2 or 3 miles from our low point where we'd then have to go up, and it started to rain again. And it was just one of those continuous rains, and some people might just love the vibe of a rainy day. I actually do, but not if I'm on a backpacking trip. Everything gets wet, and it's like, it's going to take forever to dry out. So we started to descend, and it was like clouds, low-lying clouds, and it just started to soak through, and it was continuous. So we made it to the bottom of our descent, and this is our first experience with the footlogs of the Mount Rainier National Park. They do a great job of putting the bridges over. So once again, you rarely have to get your feet wet when crossing a creek or a river. And it's really nice because they do like a cross hatching on the log. So the traction is good. The one humorous thing is they have these rails on the side, and I would say like 90% of them, the rails are leaned way over to the side where if you're going to use your hand on them, you almost feel like you would fall off. So that doesn't always help, but it was a really nice, sturdy structure. And we were pretty much wowed by how the river was raging.
Yeah, the creeks or the river, and it was kind of interesting, right? Because one thing about glacial rivers is sometimes they're just one river that runs through like a canyon type of area. But the Mowich River that we crossed there, I would say just had a dozen branches. There were so many branches, like some big enough to warrant a footlog, some small enough that you kind of would step over them.
And it was crazy because of the precipitation. There were areas where it was very clear there was little rock hops, very chill, but everything was flooding, and we didn't really have to get our shoes wet, but it made a person a little bit more deliberate with where you're putting your feet because of the rain causing the rivers to swell.
Yeah, and so that was just really interesting because one thing that I always think about when I'm approaching any creek, any river, regardless of whether there's a bridge or not, I like to just train my brain to look for a good crossing spot and think like, if there was no bridge here today, is there an area where I could cross this safely, or would I have to go up and downstream looking for a different crossing point? And I feel like the majority of creeks or rivers that I come upon, if there's a bridge, I'm still always looking, but I feel like I can always find a spot where I would say, I think I would feel comfortable going there if I had to. There were a couple spots that we came to, little branches of this river, where I honestly don't know that I would have. I mean, obviously you would spend quite a bit of time looking because you're doing the Wonderland Trail, but I don't know that I would have been comfortable crossing them without a footlog, because the way that the creek/river was flowing, it was flowing so hard that it was pushing all those rocks, down along with the current. And you could literally hear the rocks in the river just clattering and bouncing and crashing along underwater. So it's like, even if you have to step into the river, I don't know, are you just going to get hit with like a rock or something like that? So I thought that was really interesting because I don't know that I've ever actually heard, that you always see these rocks that have obviously tumbled down the stream, right? Sometimes they're on top of a bridge and you're like, wow, at some point when the water was over this bridge, at the beginning of the spring, obviously the rocks are getting pushed downstream. They're tumbling through the river and they're sitting on top of this bridge.
I'm thinking of one in the Mount Jefferson Wilderness where there were like 2 trees on top of each other over a creek, and there was a rock in between those trees, and it was like 5 feet above the typical level of the water.
Yeah. And so I think that's really added something to my mind in the future when crossing streams, to really listen and pay attention to what the stream sounds like as well. Does it sound like it's just normal water rushing, or does it sound like, can you hear the clack, clack, clack of literal boulders probably being rolled along by the stream?
And I think in this situation, the reason for it was, I think the mountain itself was getting some pretty heavy precipitation. So obviously the water was flowing much harder than it would flow if there had been no precipitation.
And I think that if the forecast was accurate, we were supposed to get 1/2 an inch to 3/4 of an inch of rain in that area that day. And it only started raining at about 2:00, and it probably rained from about 2 till 7 p.m. So we got, maybe up to an inch of rain within about 5 hours. And if you know the Pacific Northwest winter rain, you know how heavy and how hard that is. So I think that it was just a lot of precipitation on the mountain. And again, these bridges are in place from July till October. So this really shouldn't be a problem in this area, but it was just interesting because, you always talk about how with glacial rivers, you have to pay attention to all these different things and have all these considerations in mind, right? Like they're lower in the morning because they're close to the glacier that they're fed with, and it melts more throughout the day. So the flow increases. But I guess I hadn't really thought about how sometimes if it's raining hard enough, it could even be like getting those rocks to kind of flow downstream in the way that you logically know that they do, but I've never heard the power of it before. It took us a little bit longer than I thought that it would to cross the Mowich River, just because there were so many little branches that, like, the first time we went over a footlog, I was like, well, we're done crossing that. And then you would kind of follow some cairns, and then you'd be on an actual trail, like the tread of a trail. And then all of a sudden, you'd follow the cairns back out to the riverbank, and you'd cross another footlog. And so it kind of continued for a lot longer than I thought that it would. But that's very much the reality of a glacial river, because much like we talked about in an earlier series, the area that's called Graybeal in the North Cascades, that was hard to navigate because the river is always changing its route. It's not going to be the same location every year. And so basically every year there's going to be variables, and I think they probably have to reroute the trail every year just based on what the river has decided to do that year.
And I think it's also interesting because, like Carrie, I was a little surprised by how long we were in that kind of riverbed consistency where it's much sandier. And I had written in my notes that we went over 3 different footlogs. But it is interesting because looking back on a map more zoomed in and specifically, we did end up crossing the north and then the south Mowich River. So that's why it felt as extensive as it was, is because we actually did 2 river crossings over the course of probably a 1/2 mile to 3/4 of a mile. So that was interesting. And then here we'd been walking on the Wonderland Trail for a few hours, only going downhill, and we were going to have the pleasure of now ascending. So it was still raining, and it was at the point where like I've hiked in drenching rains, and it's like strange to me. If anyone has a solution, let me know, please. Gore-Tex gear, cleaned properly, reliable, in waterproof. It seems like if you're out in the rain long enough, it never is going to, it's going to wet out at some point. And I don't know if it's because of sweat building up underneath, but I'm pretty sure it did wet out because like my shorts were soaking, and I don't know, whatever, but I was wearing my raincoat and my rain pants, but then everything underneath the layers were totally soaked as well. Rachel didn't have rain pants on, and I felt like she was like, yeah, my legs are dry, and I'm like, no, they aren't, they can't be dry. But we started to ascend, and we had a good pace, and we were feeling really great, but we were just totally soaked. And it was funny because we would have this running joke where obviously when you're ascending, you would typically appreciate a few flat sections thrown in, for just a couple 100 feet at a time, just to kind of give your legs a break from continuous uphill. But the flat sections were almost worse than the uphill because it then turned the trail into just a bog. So either you were going uphill on a river trail where the water's just running down, or you're hiking through a bog trail where it's just puddles. And something that was really interesting to me on this trip, I don't know if it's that I'm not observant or if it's specific to the fall, but we must have seen thousands of mushrooms on this trip. And so there was just an abundance of fungi and mushrooms, and it was just one of those very quintessential Pacific Northwest rainy days.
So as we ascended, I feel like it felt more rainy almost to me, because on the descent, there were times I'd take my hood off because it was dry and then pop it back on. But on the way up, it was just like hood on the whole way. And I feel like we were still having a good time, but I think there were a couple points where we were like, well, I'm tired of being wet now. It's actually like not as fun to be wet. And it was weird because you'd go through these pockets of that cold air and pockets of warm air, and it just was always changing. And I think that I always think there's no way that it was as rainy as I thought it was. And then I look at videos and I'm like, it was so rainy and we are so wet. But when we got out to the top of the ridge, it was kind of nice because there were some breaks in the clouds, so we could see some fall foliage, however you say that word. We say it wrong every time. I don't know why I was bold enough to do it, but we could see, like, there was a little bit of a view around us, and it felt fun to be on a ridge. And except for one thing, it got so cold all of a sudden. Yeah. So that ridge, we just kind of were able to follow into Golden Lakes, which was nice because I feel like I had finally gotten to the point where I was like, I'm tired of going uphill in the rain. I want to be done.
And in reality, we had started our hike once again at like 1:30 p.m. And so we knew that, sunset was at 7. So you're not giving yourself a ton of wiggle room. Also, I don't really feel motivated to stop and sit down to rest if it's just continuously raining. So we had walked for, it was about 4.5 hours that it took us to get to Golden Lakes. And we'd been standing and walking the entire time, minus, I believe, like a 3-minute standing rest break to eat our Cliff Bars before we started to ascend. So, we were getting like just a little bit tired, and it was interesting because Golden Lakes is right around like 4,900 feet elevation. And like Carrie mentioned, that ridge we were walking on right before we got to camp, I don't know if it was just because there was maybe a little less protection because we were higher up and we were kind of on a ridge or what it was, but it got so incredibly cold and you're already totally soaked through. And I remember my hands especially feeling so cold.
And one thing that I said as we were entering the Golden Lakes campsite area, I was like, if there's a ranger's cabin here and there's no ranger staying there, I'm going to eat my dinner on the porch instead of eating it in the rain. And lo and behold, as we walked into the Golden Lakes campsite area, there was a beautiful ranger's cabin. And I would not do this if there was a ranger there because it is like their home. But I feel like when it's closed up for the winter, it's kind of fair game that you can definitely just sit on the porch and eat. I mean, I don't know.
So before we even set up our tents or anything, we just stood on the porch for a couple minutes because I feel like we were just so tired of being rained on. So we just stood there for a little bit, and then I feel like we were like, okay, we have like 1 hour of daylight, so we probably should continue on and set up our tent site. So we there were a couple sites that were already in use, and it's like, of course, one of the tent site areas is like down a hill, the other one is up a hill, and you don't want to go up or down, you just want to be done. But we did both, looking for a good campsite, and there was one site that we had to go down and then up, and it looked like it would have just had the most epic view of some type of a valley below, but of course everything was socked in. So it was really weird actually. So right when we arrived at Golden Lakes, it got cold and then it got super humid, and it had been cloudy, but when we arrived there, then all of a sudden, like fog rolled in. So we were dealing with like some pretty dense fog and clouds. So yeah, we kind of searched around, and basically every tent site had massive puddles on it, and we were not interested in pitching our tents in a puddle. So we finally went back to the first campsite we went to because we could kind of fit our tents under a tree on the tent pad. And then we weren't at least in a total puddle and like had a little bit of coverage. And this is something that we kind of evolved our perspective on. We always thought it would be better to be pitched under a tree because it would prevent the rain from hitting your tent as hard, but we had that belief challenged over this trip. So we huddled under the tree for a minute, kind of gathered our strength, and then we did end up pitching our tents. And so Carrie and I have our Nemo Hornet, Rachel has a Mountain Hardware tent, and we were able to get them both under the tree, but our vestibules couldn't be pitched out all the way. So I did this,
which is extra unfortunate when it's raining.
Yeah, for real. And so I like attached one of Rachel's vestibules to like our tent, and it was this really interesting thing, but we were able to fit. And then everything is wet. I don't even know if we took anything out of our packs or if we were just like, we're going to go to the ranger's cabin and we're going to eat our smushed up Subway sandwiches and then we're going to bed.
And of course, because we hadn't taken all the food out of our packs, we couldn't even leave that because you never leave an unattended pack with food in it because of bears or any other kind of animal. You don't want them to get into your pack. You know, you don't want them to get your pack and get habituated to food. So then it's like insult to injury. You have to carry your pack on your back, and all we've taken out so far is the tents and nothing else. So we carried it down to the ranger station, and when we got there was actually a guy who had pitched his tent on the ranger station, which I think normally is a pretty big no-no, but unfortunately, he was from Wisconsin, and I don't think he was quite prepared for the weather that he might face. And the tent that he had brought did not seem to have a rain fly. So I guess when he set it up with his buddies at camp, he said it was just complete, like the rain just came fully inside of it continuously. And so he put it under the roof on the ranger station because he was trying to dry out like everyone else. So then it was a little funny because it was hard to fit us and all of our packs on the porch. But I kind of told him like, hey man, like we're going to be on this porch with you eating dinner. So I hope you're cool with that because it's just what's going to happen. Like we also want to be out of the rain and there's enough space for us. And he was really cool about it. But I think he was just like, man, I can't even believe what this weather is like. And just like, he just was just like so shocked by it. And they had been doing really big miles because they were doing their trip in 5 days. So like 20-mile days. And so, I mean, he just had kind of one heck of a trip.
I think he said that that day for them, they'd done like over 6,000 feet of elevation just gain. And I have to laugh because we told him we were on our very first day, our first night, and he was like, your shoes are going to be soaked for the rest of your trip. And I'm like, I hope they aren't. But it's funny because like trail runners dry out. They dry out super well. But it's kind of ironic how when you're in the middle of that moment for us, right, it was just feeling so soaked, totally cold. You feel like you'll actually never get out of that situation, even though you know you will. The weather will get better, but it feels very stressful at the time.
I know, and I feel like that always is kind of like almost a metaphor to like tough times in your life. I was thinking about it that day. I was thinking, you know, it's like internally, I know for a fact that someday there will be sun again and I will feel warm again. But in this moment right now, I cannot get my brain to accept that fact because my brain tells me I am so cold and wet that I will never feel warm again. And it almost makes me feel like panicky. You know what I mean? Yeah. Where you're just like, I'll be cold and wet forever. I'll never get warm again. And it's like internally I'd be like, Carrie, you know that it's not going like even without the forecast, you logically know that you will be warm again someday. And so I just think like sometimes that's nice where backpacking crosses over into life, where you have to sometimes just be able to tell yourself like, I know that there will be like a better day. Like logically, I know that there will be, and you have to just kind of cling to that shred of hope. One thing that did offer me a little bit more hope on this day was this was one of maybe 2 or 3 toilets on the entire trail that was covered. It had a roof, you guys. And so it's funny because I do not love the smell of a toilet, you know,
especially backcountry toilets just have a bad odor to them.
There's a certain reek to them. But it was funny because we ate our dinner on the porch, and I could see Rachel was like visibly shivering, and I was like, we gotta just, and honestly, I had to sit down at one point because I just started feeling like kind of sick to my stomach, and it was like a bummer because I was so excited to eat my Subway, but then it wasn't that great.
And I thought it was great, and I had my sun chips while I was eating my Subway, and I was just shoving it all in.
I couldn't even eat them. And so then I was like, okay, we got to get things going. So I was like,
and here we had brought the most amazing thing ever. We had a Trader Joe's pumpkin sheet cake with cream cheese frosting to eat for our first night's supper. And none of us were even down to eat that because we were so cold and wet and just like desperate to get in our tents. So we were like, I think we're going to be eating this for breakfast tomorrow.
Yeah. And so then we left the porch and kind of got things, ready to get in the tent for the night. And I was like, I'm going to go use the bathroom. And I remember I just sat on that toilet and I lingered, I didn't need to be in there for as long as I did, which I did feel bad when I came out because Rachel was standing there waiting. And I was like, oh my gosh, I literally just made her get rained on for like probably an extra 2.5 minutes because I was just sitting here. So
and then I feel like when Carrie came back, like I had been putting stuff in the tent and getting sleeping bags inflated and everything. And I was just like, Carrie, I'm so cold and wet. And Carrie was like, you need to go sit on that toilet. And when I did, I do remember sitting there and thinking like everything will be okay because I was in a 4-walled structure with a roof and it felt a little bit warmer and it wasn't currently raining on me. And let me just backtrack, you guys. When we were getting into our tents, it was downpouring so hard that there were just massive puddles everywhere. Like you're thinking like these girls are so whiny complaining about the rain. And maybe we are, but it just is a whole nother level to be in that freezing cold rain and know that you're going to be living outside for a week. And rain kind of can bum a person out.
I just think the thing is, it's good to be realistic because I think sometimes people are like, I'm going to go backpacking and it's just going to like what I've seen on Instagram is it's just like fun all the time. And it's like, no, there's actual things that are character building, type 2 fun, hard moments. And the reality is I don't think it'll ever be like, wow, that was so fun when it was 45 degrees and it was downpouring on me. But like I can look back on it now and it was all worth it. And I wasn't like, it didn't ruin my whole week. It just kind of made me unhappy in that moment.
Honestly, I think it was even colder than that. And we'll talk about in a further episode when we met a couple that actually stayed at Mowich Lake that night and just how cold it got and what they had to deal with. But I do have to read an excerpt from my journal. So Carrie and I were super cold. Like we get into the tent and we had to write in our journals, and my journal entry is probably a third of a typical entry and so many typos, but I was just so over it, you guys. And here I wrote, climb felt good but soaked, made it to camp and it was so cold and rainy, set up tents in the rain and huddled under an overhand, typo, while eating supper. Best time was sitting on toilet in warm, dry outhouse.
And you know what? At least you had a highlight of the day. What can I say? I will say one thing that's funny is when you're that wet, you're soaked literally to the bone, and you sit down on the toilet, and it's like you almost shoot off because it's a toilet seat, but you're just completely, all of your body is so wet. And I couldn't even get my camera to work right. I was having to try to use my nose to make it to work because it was just so wet on the screen. But I'll just remember, it was so funny getting into the tent that night because like when you're wet and you're in the tiniest tent in the world and one of your vegetables is pitched over a tree root and the other one is connected to someone else's tent and then you're so wet inside the tent and you're trying to change your clothes. Like it was just a frustrating but kind of hilarious in hindsight night. And I remember as we were going to sleep, I was so like stressed because Rachel said she had water in her tent, which fortunately none was dripping on her, so we decided it was just from when she set up her tent and the downpour happened. But I was just like, wow, I hope that I didn't make a serious mistake in saying, let's all go on a fun backpacking trip in the end of September.
So that's our first day on the Wonderland Trail, and stay tuned next week because we will talk a little bit about what happened overnight between our first and second day. It was a little bit crazy, and yeah.
Other than that, thanks for that very casual throw to me. Other than that, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures if you want to see photos or videos about what we talked about today. You'll see how much rain there is. You'll see. And
if you enjoy our podcast or find it helpful, tell a friend about it. And if you'd like, please leave us a rating or review.